Let's cross back to Canberra again now and catch up with the Veterans Affairs Minister, Darren Chester. Thanks for joining us, Darren. Now, of course, you're a Nationals MP, but part of the coalition. You've seen what Corey Bernardi's been up to since he broke away from the Liberals. How would you feel about him coming back to the fold?
Well, great to be with you, Chris. And as you correctly point out, I'm a National Party MP, and it'd be a decision, I guess, for Corey himself in conjunction with the South Australian Liberal Party. As a South Australian, he'd be have to have those conversations with that division, but it's not something that I've been approached on. Obviously, the first I'd heard about it was on your commentary.
You're wise to stay away from the internal machinations of the Liberal Party, that's for sure. But what's your assessment of the contribution he's made from the Australian Conservatives to the various policy issues that have been at the forefront of public debate over the past few years?
Well, I've always got on pretty well with Corey. I mean, when I first got here, Corey was someone I got to know a little bit in the Parliament. Obviously, he's a senator, so you don't see, around the building, you don't see each other that much, but I've always got on pretty well with Corey. I think he's a man of strong conviction, strong passion for his state. He's obviously got his beliefs on different social issues, which are different to mine, but look, I think he's made a good contribution to public life, and if he's looking at other options, I guess I don't want to get too far involved in this. It's one for the South Australian Liberal Party to work their way through.
But in terms of public debate, let's leave which party he belongs to one side. In terms of public debate, he's sort of led the public debate in many respects about being careful about immigration, winding back immigration numbers, and he's done that without being discriminatory. He's also talked about issues of smaller government, focused relentlessly on lowering taxes and smaller government. And do you think he's actually been useful in helping guide the coalition back to the centre ground of politics, which has seen you end up in power for another 3 years?
Oh, well, I'm not sure how big a role Corey's played in that regard. I mean, there's a lot of hard work by a lot of MPs that got us back into government, but I think Corey, from what I've seen of his performance in the Senate, has been a constructive member of Parliament. He does have some significant convictions and passion for his state and for public policy, and he argues his case forcefully and quite respectfully. But look, I don't know what's behind the story that's prompted your questions today. But I obviously wish him well in his deliberations, and the rest of it's a question for the South Australian Liberal Party.
Now, as a Victorian, Darren Chester, you now have a right extended to you that the rest of this country don't have, and that is to have legally assisted dying should you be diagnosed with a terminal illness. How does it feel to have that right bestowed upon you?
Oh, look, I must be in the minority, I guess. If Premier Daniel Andrews just said before on your news break that the majority of Victorians support his position, I must sit in the minority then, because I'm not comfortable with it. If it was put to me, I wouldn't have voted for it. I'm unconvinced, I guess, that you can put enough protections in place for the vulnerable who may be in some way coerced or encouraged to sign up for this. So I would have voted no if I was given the opportunity, but obviously it is a state law, but it's not one that I supported.
Does it worry you about how it might be interpreted, whether there could be overreach, whether there could be mistakes?
Oh, look, I think we're just going to be very, very careful that there is enormous scrutiny of this to make sure that people don't, particularly vulnerable people, having received a poor diagnosis and may feel like they're a burden on their family or a burden on their community, somehow coerced into signing up to have this voluntary euthanasia. Now, I'm not comfortable with it, but that I don't get the chance to vote in the Victorian Parliament, obviously. But we've got to, I think, be extremely vigilant that this is not misused. I look at people who I've seen who have suffered terminal illnesses and had difficult deaths, but they've been well supported by their family, by community, by palliative nurses on the way through. And then I look at other people like, for example, Neil Danaher with motor neurone disease, a fellow who's been an extraordinary champion of this, trying to cure this disease, and outlived all the expectations when it was first put upon him when he had the diagnosis. Now, he has led an extraordinary and meaningful life post that diagnosis, and it would have been tragic if people take this option prematurely.
Yeah, of course you make the point that this is restricted to Victoria. It's a state law, and there's no constitutional argument about that. We know the states have the right to legislate in this area, but in an era where we're seeing so much focus on national coordination, on a federal government approach, whether it be in healthcare and hospitals, to schools funding, to even road safety rules. Do you think it's disappointing to have a state so far ahead of the rest of the country, or making a retrograde step, depending on how you look at it? Do you think it would be preferable to have a national approach to something like euthanasia?
Well, Chris, I would prefer it if it was a national approach, but I mean, I think you understand, as I understand, that where there are areas of clear state jurisdiction, there's no capacity for the federal parliament to override. Where both have jurisdictional opportunities, I guess there's more opportunity for a federal intervention, if you like. But I don't think there's any capacity for that in this case. I would prefer us to have consistent laws on such major public policy directions in our country. But you know, we've got this situation now in Victoria. The legislation has gone through. I mean, the Andrews government was re-elected. Perhaps there is a majority support in Victoria, I'm not sure, but I think the important thing for those of us who are a little bit, I guess, sceptical or concerned about it is to remain very vigilant and make sure that the law is not misused, that vulnerable Victorians aren't coerced into a situation where they sign up for this, that perhaps they wasn't of their own free will. And I, with all due respect, I understand there are a lot of precautions that have been put in place, but I am still a bit uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, I opened up the show with my concerns about this, and one of the things that really highlights my concerns is the conflicting messages we're putting out to our society, and especially at a time where we've never seen greater community government focus on suicide and on funding and programs to try and combat the scourge of suicide. At the same time we're doing this in Victoria, it seems a very paradoxical message to be sending about the primacy we put on human life. Tell me your thoughts on that, given that you're currently heavily involved in trying to combat the alarming rate of veteran suicides.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting point you make, Chris. I mean, it's almost ingrained in our instinct is to fight like hell to stay alive, and we try to support others in our community for that to occur. And the Prime Minister, I think, has been right in highlighting concerns around mental well-being, mental ill health across our nation. I feel an extraordinary sense of guilt that here in Australia, this incredibly wealthy, prosperous, harmonious society, largely harmonious society, there's 3,000 Australians on average are taking their own life every year, and I feel very uncomfortable with that as well. And within my own portfolio responsibilities in Veterans Affairs and Defence personnel, we have in the order of 30 veterans taking their own lives on average over the last 15 years. And there's a lot of steps being taken, a lot of programs being put in place to try and prevent that, to try and improve the mental well-being of our veterans. And I think we are making some good progress, but there's always more work to be done in that regard. And I can assure you that my secretary, Liz Costin, a lady who's had 30 years' experience in the Army, is working very closely with the government to try and reduce the incidence of suicide in the veteran community.
Darren Chester, there's a strong push, though, including from elements of the RSL, the New South Wales President's James Brown, for instance, also across a media campaign and other politicians pushing for a royal commission into veterans' suicides. Why are you resisting that?
I can understand why, and it's been quite a strong community petition as well. I can understand in particular why the community is clicking on that petition and supporting it, because Australians feel a very strong sense of identity and national heritage attached to our Australian Defence Force, and we're proud of the service the men and women provide in our uniform. And they want to know that their government is looking after their veterans when they leave the Australian Defence Force. So I can understand why Australians are keen to see everything being done. In terms of Mr Brown, the RSL in New South Wales, it's the only RSL in Australia which has suggested that a Royal Commission is the right approach. The other RSLs are supporting the work we're already undertaking and working with us to try and implement the programs that we believe are going to make a real difference in terms of mental well-being and suicide prevention. But the Prime Minister has made it very clear that all options should be on the table. He's asked me to come back to him now with the full details of the work the DVA is already doing, Department of Veteran Affairs is already doing, and that'll be happening in the coming weeks. I'm sure you're aware the Productivity Commission's been doing some work now for the past year, which will report back to government at the end of June, and that is basically the full assessment of DVA. How do we make sure the Department of Veterans Affairs is fit for purpose for decades into the future, and that work will come to us in a matter of weeks. So I want to see those reports. I want to have a good look at those before we make any further decisions. But I am very conscious of the fact that, for me, the only acceptable rate of suicide amongst veterans is 0, and the only acceptable rate for the Australian people is 0, and we've got to keep working towards that.
Yeah, it's important work. Good luck with that, and thanks for joining us, Darren Chester.